The Galactic Council chamber was unlike anything humans had ever seen. It was a circle so vast that voices carried for long seconds before fading. The floor gleamed like black glass, reflecting the light of floating crystals that hung in the air. Delegates from hundreds of worlds filled the rows. Their skin shimmered, their eyes glowed, their robes whispered as they shifted in their seats. To them, this place was sacred, a hall where decisions that shaped galaxies were made. In the center stood a lone human envoy. He wore no armor, no crown, no flashing jewels. His suit was simple, his posture calm. For many, this made him look weak compared to the towering figures around him. To others, the quiet confidence unsettled them. No one could decide if he was brave or simply foolish. Among the delegates was an officer from a warrior race feared across 3 star systems. Her armor clinked when she moved, sharp edges catching the light. Her face was painted with the red lines of combat victories, each mark a reminder of the lives she had taken. She leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the human as though studying prey before the strike. The human spoke, his words measured. He thanked the council for inviting Earth to stand among them. He spoke of trade, of cooperation, of shared futures. His voice was not loud, but steady, carrying an honesty that made a few delegates nod despite themselves. The officer snorted, her lips twisting into a cruel smile. "You dare to speak of unity?" she said, her voice carrying easily. "Your species crawled out of a death world. You fight storms, poisons, and beasts every day just to survive. And you think you belong here among the civilized." A murmur spread across the chamber. Some nodded in agreement. Others leaned forward, curious to see what the human would do. The officer's insult was not just sharp, it was dangerous. This chamber was supposed to be a place of respect. To mock someone here was to test the limits of tradition. The human did not answer. His calm eyes met hers, and the silence stretched so long that some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The officer rose slowly, her tall frame casting a shadow over the envoy. She stepped down into the center, her boots ringing like hammers with each strike against the glass floor. "I have killed creatures stronger than you on training days," she hissed. "One strike from me and your bones will shatter like glass. Do you not fear me, human?" Still, he did not move. He did not even blink. His lack of reaction infuriated her. Anger turned her voice into thunder. "Look at him," she shouted to the chamber. "So fragile, so weak. A single blow and his life is gone. This is what Earth sends us." Some delegates laughed, their voices cold. Others lowered their eyes, unwilling to witness what they knew was about to happen. The officer raised her hand high, her claws glinting under the chamber lights. Gasps echoed. No one dared strike another inside the council chamber. No one had in centuries. Yet she was ready to break that law for the sake of pride. The human finally spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper, yet clear enough to carry. "Don't." One word. No anger, no plea, only certainty. The officer froze for half a second, then laughed harshly. "Don't?" she repeated mockingly. "What will you do to stop me? Fragile human. Weak deathworlder. You should kneel, not speak." Her hand remained lifted. The chamber held its breath. Every eye was fixed on the space between her raised strike and the human's calm figure. Time seemed to slow, every heartbeat stretching into eternity. But some noticed something strange. The human's eyes did not follow her hand. His gaze was not on her at all. It was fixed just over her shoulder, as though he was waiting for something. The officer sneered, ready to finish the motion. "I will teach you fear," she said, and she swung her hand down. But before it could land, the chamber grew colder. Whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Delegates shifted, some rising to their feet. Something was behind her. A shadow, a presence that no one had seen enter. The officer's arm trembled as she felt it too late, the sensation of being watched by something far stronger than herself. The human stood motionless, still calm, still waiting. His warning had not been to protect himself. It had been to warn her, and in that suspended moment, as her hand hovered just above his face, the entire council realized something terrifying. The human was not alone. The chamber seemed frozen in time. The officer's hand hung in the air, just inches from the human envoy's face. But the real weight in the room was not her arm. It was the silence. Delegates leaned forward, breaths caught, eyes flickering between the raised strike and the human who still stood perfectly still. He did not look afraid. He did not step back. His calm was unnatural, and that calm made the tension worse. The officer's smirk widened as she felt the eyes of the council upon her. She had made her point. She believed fear had already been planted. Yet, as she glanced back at the human, her victory felt hollow. His expression was unchanged, his eyes steady, as if he had already decided how this moment would end. "Why do you not beg?" she demanded, her voice sharp and filled with pride. "Do you think silence will save you? Do you think your words mean anything here?" The human tilted his head slightly, studying her as though she were the one under judgment. He finally answered, but his voice was calm, so calm it unnerved even those who had no stake in the quarrel. "You've already lost," he said. The words struck deeper than a shout ever could. They were not spoken with arrogance, not even with anger. They were spoken with certainty, and that certainty rippled across the chamber like an unseen wave. Delegates turned to each other, whispering, wondering what the human meant. The officer laughed harshly, her armor rattling with the sound. "Lost? To you? A soft creature of dirt and storms? No, human. You do not understand strength." Her hand began to move downward again. She was determined to finish her strike, to prove her dominance in front of the council. But as her hand descended, the air around her shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint ripple, as though the space itself grew heavier. The officer faltered for the first time, her hand trembling slightly. She forced herself forward, refusing to show weakness. But others noticed. Delegates at the edges of the chamber whispered nervously, some leaning back in their seats as if distance could protect them. The human never moved. His gaze did not follow her hand. He looked past her, over her shoulder, as if his attention was on something else entirely. And then it happened. The officer felt it before she saw it. The cold prickle down her spine, the heavy presence pressing at her back. She turned her head just slightly, enough to glimpse the shadow rising behind her. Her confidence cracked. For the first time, doubt entered her eyes. "What?" she whispered, the word barely audible. The chamber erupted into soft gasps. A figure had appeared, though no one had seen a door open or a guard enter. It was tall, wrapped in dark armor that glimmered faintly under the council's lights. Its face was hidden beneath a smooth helm, featureless, except for a single line of light across where its eyes should have been. Every delegate in the chamber recognized it for what it was, though few had ever seen one with their own eyes. A protector, a shadow of earth, a guardian that moved not by permission of the council but by the will of humanity alone. The officer's arm froze, caught between pride and fear. She tried to finish the strike, but the armored hand of the protector closed around her wrist, stopping it as if it weighed nothing. The sound was soft, a simple grip, but the finality of it rang louder than any shout. Gasps turned into silence. Delegates stared, wide-eyed, at the impossible sight. The human envoy finally moved. He raised his hand slightly, not in command but in acknowledgement. His eyes stayed on the officer, his voice soft and measured. "I warned you," he said. The officer tried to jerk free, but the protector's grip was unbreakable. Panic began to bleed through her pride, and she snarled, baring her teeth. This is a violation," she shouted, her voice trembling. "No blood may be shed in this chamber." The human tilted his head again. His calm expression had not changed. "You raised your hand first," he said. Those words struck the council harder than any weapon. He was right. She had been the one to break the unspoken law. She had been the one to turn insult into violence. Now, the judgment would not come from rules or votes. It would come from the shadow she had provoked. The officer struggled once more, but the protector's grip was absolute. Its helm turned slightly, and though it had no visible eyes, the weight of its gaze pressed into her. Her breath quickened. For the first time in her long military career, she felt truly powerless. The chamber remained silent, waiting. The human gave no further command. He didn't need to. The protector did not move with hesitation or mercy. It moved with purpose, as though everything that followed had already been decided the moment she raised her hand. The officer's voice cracked into a desperate shout, but her words died in her throat. The chamber no longer heard her voice. It heard only the echo of inevitability. The delegates sat frozen, realizing they were witnessing something that would be told for generations. A moment that would change how they looked at humans forever. And in the center of it all, the human envoy remained perfectly calm, his eyes steady, his breathing even. He had never raised his hand, never lifted his voice. He had simply spoken a warning. Now, the council was about to learn what happened when that warning was ignored. The chamber had grown so quiet that even the soft hum of the floating crystals could be heard. Every delegate, no matter their species, sat frozen as the armored protector held the officer's wrist in its grip. The difference in size between them was almost laughable, her massive arm, covered in battle-forged armor, against a single dark gauntlet. Yet it was no contest. She strained, muscles trembling, but her hand remained trapped, unable to move even an inch. The human envoy had not spoken again. He stood in silence, letting the weight of the moment fall on the chamber. His calmness was louder than any cry of protest could have been. The officer's face twisted with rage as her pride cracked under the pressure of restraint. "Release me!" she roared, turning her glare on the shadowy figure behind her. "You dare touch me? You dare touch an officer of the honored guard?" The protector gave no answer. Its faceless helm did not tilt. Its stance did not shift. It stood as still as a statue carved from the bones of stars. The only sound was the faint hiss of its armor moving with perfect precision. Whispers spread through the council rows. Some delegates recognized the shape, the silent figure that haunted rumors. Earth's protectors were never officially acknowledged, yet every species had heard whispers of them. Soldiers who could appear without warning, unseen until they chose to reveal themselves. They were ghosts in armor, moving in shadows, watching silently. Few believed such rumors until now. The officer snarled, her voice echoing. "Do you think this trick will frighten me? I have crushed armies. I have spilled blood across battlefields that would make your people weep." Her defiance faltered when the protector finally moved. Its grip tightened, not enough to break bone, but enough to make the armored plates of her gauntlet groan under the pressure. The sound filled the chamber, a metallic cry of surrender. The officer's eyes widened in shock. No one had ever forced her hand down before. The human envoy raised his chin slightly. His voice was low, but steady enough to cut through the whispers. "You were warned," he said. The officer shook her head, desperate to cling to her pride. "You think your shadow will scare me? This chamber has laws. No blood can be spilled here. Your protector cannot harm me." The envoy's gaze sharpened. "It will not harm you," he said, pausing. "It will judge you." The protector's helm tilted for the first time, the glowing line where its eyes should have been narrowing. The chamber seemed to shiver with the weight of that single movement. Delegates felt their throats tighten. Some leaned back in their seats, trying to escape the oppressive pressure filling the room. The officer tried to pull away once more, but her strength meant nothing. Panic flashed in her eyes, though she masked it with anger. "This is madness," she shouted. "This is a council chamber, not a battlefield." The envoy finally turned to the rest of the council. His expression was calm, almost cold. "Then perhaps you should have remembered that before you raised your hand." A ripple of silence swept across the delegates. Many of them avoided the envoy's eyes, suddenly aware of how fragile their own authority seemed under his words. For centuries, they had looked at humans as the newcomers, the weaker ones, the primitives from a hostile world. But in this moment, they saw something different. They saw control, strength, and the terrifying calm of a predator that did not need to roar to prove its dominance. The officer's knees bent slightly under the pressure of the protector's grip. Her arm, once raised with confidence, now shook uncontrollably. Beads of sweat slid down her face, mixing with the red paint of her war markings. The humiliation cut deeper than any blade. "Stop this!" she demanded, her voice breaking for the first time. But the envoy did not answer. He did not need to. The protector stepped forward, forcing her down onto one knee. The sound of her armor scraping the polished glass floor echoed like thunder. Gasps erupted across the chamber. A warrior of her reputation, brought to her knees without a single strike. The envoy finally spoke, his voice soft but unshakable. "A raised hand against a human is not an insult. It is a choice, and every choice carries a price." The officer's breathing quickened. She looked up at the envoy, and for the first time, true fear filled her eyes. She had believed herself untouchable within these walls, protected by law, by tradition, by her own strength. But all of those protections had vanished the moment she ignored his warning. The protector's grip shifted slightly. The chamber felt colder, the air heavy, as though the entire hall leaned closer to see what would happen next. Delegates whispered furiously, torn between outrage and awe. The envoy did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply looked down at her, his calm expression unchanging, and said, "The judgment has already begun." And in that single sentence, the council realized something terrifying. The human had never been afraid. He had never been alone. The protector was not his shield, it was his answer. The unseen power of humanity had finally revealed itself. The chamber of the council was heavy with silence. No one moved. No one dared even breathe too loudly. The officer's raised hand had been forced down, her knees pressed against the shining glass floor. The protector's grip was steady, cold, and final. The officer's pride burned hotter than any fire, but it could not melt the iron grip around her wrist. She struggled, twisting with all her strength. Muscles bulged under her armor, the veins in her neck strained, but it was useless. Her hand was trapped as if held by the weight of a star. "Unhand me!" she roared, her voice echoing through the chamber. It was the cry of someone who had never been defied, who had never been restrained in her life. But now, in front of every watching delegate, she was powerless. The human envoy stood quietly just a few steps away. His face was calm, almost distant. He had not lifted a hand to fight, nor raised his voice in anger. Yet it was clear to every eye in the chamber that the officer's fate rested entirely in his silence. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For centuries, their chamber had been a place of words, not weapons. Here, disputes were settled with diplomacy, not blood. But now, they were watching a scene unfold that felt more like a battlefield than a hall of law. The officer's breathing grew heavier. Panic flickered behind her anger. She looked at the envoy with desperate eyes, searching for any sign of mercy. "You cannot do this," she spat. "This is forbidden. No violence in the chamber. Your protector is breaking the sacred law." The envoy finally looked at her directly. His voice was low, steady, but it carried across the chamber like a hammer striking steel. "You broke the law first," he said. Her mouth opened to protest, but no sound came. The truth of his words hung in the air like a blade. She had been the one to raise her hand, to threaten violence in the chamber. Now, the price of that action was unfolding before everyone's eyes. The protector tightened its grip slightly. The sound of metal groaning filled the silence. The officer winced as her own armor bent against her. She tried to pull away again, but it was like fighting the roots of a mountain. Her strength meant nothing. Gasps spread through the rows of delegates as the protector's other hand rose slowly. It moved with a terrifying calm, not rushed, not hesitant. The glowing line across its helm narrowed like an eye watching prey. "No," the officer whispered, fear breaking through her voice. She twisted, her painted markings smeared with sweat. "Wait!" The envoy did not blink. He gave no command, no order. He did not need to. The protector moved because judgment had already been passed. With one fluid motion, the armored hand struck. Not a wild blow, not a clumsy strike. It was precise, swift, and final. The chamber filled with the sharp sound of steel meeting flesh. A heartbeat later, silence fell again, deeper than before. The officer's body collapsed forward onto the glass floor. Her head, severed cleanly, rolled across the polished surface until it stopped at the feet of the council leader. The chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates leapt from their seats, voices clashing, some shouting in outrage, others frozen in stunned horror. The sacred chamber had seen its first death in centuries, and it was not just anyone. It was one of their most feared officers. The council leader trembled as he stared down at the fallen head. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hands shook as he gripped the railing before him. The air in the chamber was thick with fear, the kind that pressed into the skin and sat heavy on the chest. Meanwhile, the human envoy stood perfectly still. His eyes were calm, his breathing even. He had not moved during the execution. He had not spoken a single command. Yet the message was unmistakable. Humanity would not bow, would not bend, would not accept insult without consequence. The protector released the officer's lifeless wrist and stepped back, silent as stone. The glow of its helm dimmed slightly, as though the task was complete. The envoy finally spoke, his voice soft, but sharp enough to slice through the chaos. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "Raise your hand against a human, and you will not raise it again." The chamber froze. The words rang in every delegate's ears, leaving them cold with fear. For centuries, they had mocked Earth, calling it a cursed deathworld, a place of storms and beasts. But in this moment, they understood something far worse than storms. They understood that Earth produced humans who did not bluff, who did not break, who carried protectors that struck without hesitation. Some delegates bowed their heads, afraid to meet the envoy's eyes. Others whispered furiously, their fear mixing with anger. But none could deny the truth. A new line had been drawn in the galaxy. The body of the officer remained sprawled on the floor, her pride shattered, her legacy ended in a single breath of judgment. And the council knew that her fall was more than personal. It was symbolic. The age where humans were dismissed as weak had ended. The chamber, once filled with arguments and noise, now stood in complete silence. Not even the hum of the floating crystals could soften the weight of the moment. The officer's lifeless body lay sprawled on the polished floor, her head resting against the base of the council leader's podium. The red paint of her battle markings had mixed with the darker stain spreading across the glass. Dozens of alien delegates sat frozen, their faces pale or twisted in shock. For centuries, no blood had been spilled inside these walls. The council chamber was meant to be a place above violence, a place where war and death never entered. Yet here, before their very eyes, one of their strongest officers had been cut down as if she were nothing more than a warning. The human envoy did not move. He stood calmly, hands at his sides, eyes watching the delegates with an unreadable expression. He had not raised his voice, had not lifted a hand, yet the execution had happened. That silence, that stillness, was more terrifying than any act of rage. The council leader finally spoke, his voice trembling. This is impossible," he whispered. "The chamber has been violated." But no one replied. The words seemed weak in the heavy silence. Everyone knew the truth. It had not been the human who broke the sanctity of the chamber. It had been the officer when she raised her hand to strike. And everyone knew what followed was not lawlessness, it was judgment. One delegate, a tall creature with wings folded behind its back, stood slowly. "This cannot stand," it said, though its voice cracked with fear. "No one may kill within these walls. This is blasphemy." The human envoy turned his eyes toward the speaker. His expression remained calm, but the look alone silenced the winged delegate. He sat down quickly, avoiding his gaze. Another delegate whispered. He did not give the order. The protector acted on its own. The chamber filled with murmurs. That realization was far worse than any imagined command. If the human did not even need to give an order for the execution to happen, then what kind of power did Earth truly wield? Were these protectors living weapons bound only to instinct? Or were they the silent will of humanity itself, answering threats before words could finish? The council leader swallowed hard, trying to gather control. Order! I demand order! His voice shook, his hands trembling as they gripped the railing. But the chamber was beyond his control now. The silence was too deep, the fear too sharp. The human envoy finally broke the stillness. His voice was calm, steady, and yet it carried across the chamber like a cold wind. You invited us here to speak, he said. We came with peace. We came with respect. But your officer raised her hand against a human, and for that, she chose her fate. The words were not shouted, but they struck harder than thunder. Every delegate felt the weight behind them. It was not arrogance. It was not cruelty. It was truth, spoken with the calm certainty of someone who knew no one would dare challenge him now. Some delegates lowered their eyes, unable to meet his gaze. Others shifted uncomfortably, trying to hide the fear written plainly on their faces. A few sat rigid, hands gripping the edges of their seats, torn between outrage and terror. The council leader, pale and shaking, tried again. If violence is to rule this chamber, then all order will collapse. Do you mean to turn the council into a battlefield? The envoy's calm eyes rested on him. No, he said simply. But if any hand is raised against my people again, you already know the price. Those words hung in the air, heavy and final. No one dared respond. The silence that followed was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of fear. Delegates whispered quietly among themselves, voices trembling. Some muttered about Earth being a cursed deathworld, a place where storms shaped monsters instead of men. Others whispered about strength, about how no other race would have stood so calm under threat, how no other envoy could have turned humiliation into dominance with nothing but silence and certainty. The council chamber, once the safest place in the galaxy, now felt dangerous, haunted by the memory of what had just happened. No one looked at the human envoy as weak anymore. No one laughed at Earth as primitive. Not after this. The envoy took a single step forward, his protector at his side, still silent, still unmoving. The sound of his foot on the glass floor echoed through the chamber like a drumbeat. Every delegate stiffened at the sound. He spoke again, his tone softer now, but no less commanding. Remember this moment. Remember her choice. And remember what followed. That is the measure of humanity. The silence deepened. No one dared argue. No one dared even breathe too loudly. For the first time in living memory, the council chamber did not belong to the council. It belonged to the human standing in its center. And in that silence, every delegate understood a truth they had long denied. Humanity was not to be mocked, not to be underestimated. They were no longer just guests in the galaxy. They were a force the galaxy would have to respect or fear. The chamber remained wrapped in silence long after the officer's body was removed. The glass floor was cleaned, the stains erased, but nothing could erase the memory of what the delegates had witnessed. The silence was not respect, it was fear. Every eye that turned toward the human envoy now carried caution, suspicion, or a quiet form of respect that bordered on submission. The council leader sat stiffly at his podium, his hands folded tightly, as if clinging to control he no longer truly held. Around him, the delegates shifted in their seats. Their voices were low, their words quick and nervous. The great chamber, once filled with confidence, now felt like a hall of shadows. The human envoy stood calmly, his protector at his side, silent and motionless. He did not raise his voice, yet his very presence forced the council to remain uneasy. Every time the glow of the protector's helm moved, a ripple of dread spread across the rows. It was not only fear of what had happened, it was the fear of what it meant. For centuries, the council had seen themselves as the center of galactic order. They created laws, enforced rules, and decided which races rose to power and which stayed in the shadows. But in a single moment, that balance had cracked. One human envoy, backed by a silent protector, had shaken their authority without firing a single weapon. A delegate from the Vaynar system whispered loudly enough to be heard. If one officer can be ended in an instant, what does that say about the strength of Earth? What if there are more of these protectors? Another, with scales that shimmered under the crystal light, hissed in reply. They call themselves deathworlders. Perhaps now we understand why. Whispers turned into quiet arguments, and arguments grew into murmurs of panic. Some wanted to demand Earth's expulsion from the Council. Others warned that such defiance would invite disaster. The human envoy remained silent through it all, his eyes calm, his posture steady. He seemed to know that the chamber itself would speak louder than anything he could say. Finally, the council leader slammed his hand against the podium, his voice sharp. Order! The council must not descend into chaos. But his voice shook, and everyone heard it. His authority, once unquestioned, now cracked like fragile glass. The envoy finally spoke. His tone was not loud, but it carried through the chamber like a quiet storm. You saw what happened, not because I wished it, not because I ordered it, but because your officer raised her hand against a human. That is the only truth here. The delegates shifted again, some bowing their heads to avoid his gaze. Others clenched their fists, angry at themselves for their own fear. You call this chamber sacred, the envoy continued, and yet it was your own who broke its law. We did not come to challenge you. We came to stand with you. But if this council cannot respect humanity, then perhaps you cannot be trusted to respect yourselves. The words struck deep. Delegates exchanged nervous glances. The insult was not shouted, but it was sharper than any blade. He had turned the chamber's shame back upon them. A delegate rose, trembling, his eyes fixed on the envoy. Do you mean to threaten the council? Do you mean to take control? The envoy's gaze shifted toward him, steady and cold. I do not need to threaten you, he said. I do not need to take control. You gave it away the moment you let fear guide you. The hall went still again. His words were not arrogance, they were truth, and everyone knew it. Some delegates, shaken, began to nod slowly. They understood what had changed. For centuries, they had believed power rested in their titles, their laws, their rituals. But now they saw power for what it truly was, the ability to command respect without asking for it, the ability to stand unshaken while others trembled. And in that sense, humanity had just proven itself more powerful than all of them. The council leader lowered his eyes, his shoulders heavy. He knew the chamber no longer belonged to him. The shift had happened. It was not loud, not dramatic. It was quiet, subtle, but undeniable. From this day forward, every race in the chamber would treat humanity differently. Not as weaklings from a cursed world. Not as fragile newcomers. But as something far more dangerous. Equals who could not be controlled. The protector's helm glowed faintly as it turned, scanning the chamber, reminding everyone that the silence was not safety. It was warning. The envoy looked around the hall one final time. His voice was quiet, but it pressed into every heart like a weight they could not shake. You wanted to see if humanity belonged here, he said. Now you know, and you will remember. Not a single delegate dared to answer. The council had shifted. The balance of power was no longer theirs alone, and the galaxy itself would never be the same. The council chamber had emptied, but its silence lingered long after the delegates left. The floating crystals still glowed softly, casting long shadows across the polished glass floor. To any visitor, the chamber looked unchanged, but for those who had been present, it would never feel the same again. The memory of the fallen officer clung to the walls like smoke, invisible but heavy. The human envoy walked out of the chamber slowly, his protector at his side. He did not look back, because he knew the image of this day would remain in every alien mind without his reminder. Behind him, the delegates whispered among themselves, too afraid to raise their voices. Their fear was no longer about the protector's blade. It was about what humanity represented. Word spread quickly. Across the stations and ships that orbited the council's world, rumors spread like wildfire. Some told the story as if the human envoy had commanded the execution with a single glance. Others whispered that the protector had acted on its own, proving humans were surrounded by unseen forces. A few, desperate to make sense of it, said Earth had hidden an entire army of these shadow warriors across the galaxy, waiting for the moment to strike. No version of the story was entirely true, but none of them mattered. What mattered was the message. Never raise a hand against a human. On distant worlds, merchants paused to retell the tale, their voices hushed but urgent. Soldiers in faraway garrisons muttered the story before sleep, their eyes darting toward the shadows. Leaders on proud thrones called secret meetings, asking their advisors the same question. If one human envoy could unseat the balance of the council, what would humanity do if truly provoked? For the first time, fear of Earth was not about the storms, the beasts, or the deathworld itself. It was about the people. Humans had shown that they did not need to shout, did not need to boast. They carried a calm power that silenced armies without firing a shot. The council, once the highest authority, found itself changed as well. The delegates who had been present that day carried the memory like a weight. When they looked at the empty center of the chamber, they no longer saw only light and glass. They saw a human standing tall, unbroken, while one of their own fell. Laws were still written, votes still passed, but beneath every decision was the unspoken thought. Will humanity approve? Will humanity tolerate this? The council leader himself felt it most. When he closed his eyes, he saw the officer's head at his feet, the envoy's calm words echoing in his ears. He had ruled the chamber for decades with confidence, but now, his hands shook whenever he spoke. Authority was still his by title, but everyone knew the balance had shifted. The envoy, however, did not claim the shift. He did not demand the council kneel or surrender. He simply returned to his seat, calm as ever, his protector fading into the shadows. That silence, that lack of hunger for power, made the fear even sharper. For arrogance can be resisted, but quiet certainty is harder to fight. Generations later, when the story was retold, details blurred. Some described the envoy as a giant, his shadow swallowing the chamber. Others swore the protector's armor glowed with fire, its blade dripping light instead of blood. Each retelling made the humans larger than life. But one part of the story never changed. The officer raised her hand against a human, and the council received her head instead. On Earth, people heard the whispers too. Some celebrated the envoy as a hero, proof that humanity had finally claimed its place among the stars. Others worried, knowing fear was a dangerous crown to wear. But even on Earth, the truth was undeniable. The galaxy would never again see humans as weak. The envoy himself remained silent about the event. He wrote no speeches, left no explanations. When asked, he only said, "We came in peace. She chose otherwise." That single statement traveled across the stars as well, carried by those who had witnessed the chamber's silence. The legacy was not just fear, it was respect, sharpened by caution. Humanity had shown its teeth without raising its voice. The council would still meet, laws would still be passed, but deep inside, every delegate carried a hidden truth. Humanity was not to be provoked. And so a new legend was born. Not of storms, not of beasts, not even of war, but of the day a calm envoy stood in silence while a proud officer fell. The day the galaxy learned that behind every human's steady gaze, there might stand a protector no one could see. From that day forward, one phrase echoed across the stars, whispered by merchants, soldiers, and rulers alike. Never raise your hand against a human.